Okay, so now that I've got my sweep animated and doing its thing, I want to make a whole bunch of these. I want to clone it, copy it, and I also want to kind of offset them in time and maybe in space so that we've got a bit of random variation going on. So I'm going to use a cloner for this. So in my MoGraph menu, I can create a cloner. Now, a cloner clones stuff, pretty obvious. The way that it works is that you drag and drop any object into a cloner. So I'm going to take this sweep that I've already created that's animated, and I'm going to drag and drop this whole system into the cloner. What you should see now, the default is 3 copies of this object, and they're offset slightly in their height, and they are synchronized and animated exactly the same way. So that's the initial cloning done, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make more of these clones. So if I select the cloner object, it's got a whole bunch of attributes. What I want to change is the number or the count of copies, the amount of clones. So there's a count value there. I can turn that up, and I'm going to make I'll make 10 of these. Now, one thing you'll notice with the default settings is that each of these clones is offset vertically in space. It's offset in the y-axis, so all the clones are stacked one on top of the other. We actually want our clones pretty much in the same space, but we want them offset in time, and we want maybe a little bit of random movement. So first, before I create this randomizing function, I'm going to change my clones so that they're all in the same place. So with a cloner, the default parameters we've got partway through our cloner's attributes. We've got position, scale, and rotation, and the default is to shift each clone 50 centimeters in Y. I actually don't want them shifted. I'm going to use a random effector to do that for me. So I'm going to set that back to 0. What I've actually got now is 10 clones all sitting in exactly the same place. So it's cloned, that's great. Now I want to use a random effector to change things up a little bit. So I'm going to go to my MoGraph menu, and under Effectors, I've got a random effector. Now here's a little tip. If you have a MoGraph object selected when you create an effector, that effector will be automatically applied to that MoGraph object. If you don't have a MoGraph object selected, MoGraph effector random, I'd have to go to my cloner, go to the effectors, and manually drag and drop that in. So that's just a good little shortcut. If you have a MoGraph object selected when you make an effector, it's automatically applied. Okay, so the cool thing about my random effector is that by dropping it onto my cloner, I can now see I've automatically got a whole bunch of random positions. This is great. They're all still synchronized in terms of time, but I've got a bunch of random positions. So let's have a look at that random effector and see how we can fine-tune it. If we select the random effector, we can see that it can control the position of our clones, and it can change their position a varying amount. So we can set a really large number, which means we'll get a really big spread of random objects. I'm going to keep mine quite small, so they're fairly close together. The other thing that I want to do is I'm going to change the scale of these just a little bit, so I've got a little bit of variation in scale. So I'm going to turn on scale. I want to scale these things uniformly. That means they get scaled equally in all axes, and that keeps the shape of them intact and doesn't stretch them too much in any one way or the other. So once I turn on uniform scale, I can then adjust my scale value just a small amount, and if I adjust it to a positive value, we get larger random scaled objects. If we make it a negative value, we get smaller scaled objects. So we can just set up some random scale to create a bit of variation. Now, another thing that I can also do is I can change the rotation, the random rotation. If you have a look at the clones, they're all pretty much in the same position in terms of how far they've traveled around this helix. They're all sort of neck and neck as they go around. If I turn on rotation scaling, rotation randomizing, I can just change one axis at a time. And if I click on this H, which is for heading, I can see I'm actually really mixing up how far around this helix they're traveling. Now, I'm not actually changing the distance along the helix, I'm just changing the rotation value of each individual clone. If I change these other rotation values, I start tilting them on a different axes. I don't really want that. I want them to continue just running along the helix up and down. If I wanted more of sort of an atoms spinning around kind of look, I could change these axes quite a lot, but I actually just want these sweeps just to rotate and spin around my logo as they rise. So that's great. That's randomizing the position, the scale, and the rotation of them. They're actually still all animating at the same time. We can see from frame 0, if I click and drag, they're all coming into existence at the same time, and they're all spinning around. They're offset because of that random rotation, but I actually want a little bit more randomization in when they occur. So what I can do in my random effector, I've actually got a time offset value. If I change this, the animation that I've got set for that particular object will be randomly offset by a maximum of this number of frames. So if I set something like maybe 20 frames, it means now I've got over 20 frames, my clones start to appear and do their spiraling and their movement up that helix and around the logo. So that's really cool. This is what MoGraph is really good for, taking a simple animation and then creating a lot more complexity and visual interest by duplicating and randomizing, and we get a really sort of complex, sophisticated looking result from something relatively simple.